Fascism is a word that you have likely heard a lot lately. No matter where you live or what you believe in, the political discourse of the past decade or so has had frequent mention of this term in one way or another. Be it the nation's top politicians, millionaire TV anchors, or nerdy 16-year-olds whose opinions don't matter, everyone's talking about it. Now, granted, not everything being said about fascism is true per se. I mean, us humans aren't exactly known for being bastions of truth. Far from it, actually. And in keeping with this trend, many have said, and will continue to say, outlandish things about fascism. Fascism is any form of action taken by the state, or leftists are the real fascists, and other nonsensical things. The universal negative connotation of the word fascism is often used by many to push an agenda or to win another abstract battle in another abstract culture war. Now, because of this cheapening of the term, you may feel inclined to just dismiss any accusations or mention of fascism as just another load of hot air, a boy who cried wolf situation. However, it is important to note that the increase in paranoia about fascism is not without good reason. Because yes, fascism and similar ideologies are indeed on the rise at an alarming rate, and yes, it is definitely something that you should be concerned about. Many will dismiss such threats by saying that it can't happen here. Heck, I certainly had those thoughts myself in the past. But the fact of the matter is that not only can fascism happen anywhere, but in many places that pride themselves on their virtues of freedom, equality, liberty, democracy, justice, progress, and other bedrock principles of a free and advanced society, it has already taken root and started to bloom. Well, the obvious question to start with is, what is fascism? There isn't one single correct answer for this, as fascism, like other political ideologies such as communism and anarchism, comes in many different forms. As Tristan Johnson from Step Back History puts it in his video What is Fascism? We know it when we see it, but no one ever has a satisfying definition. Among what is objectively known is that fascism has its roots in 17 and 1800s Europe, among a myriad of social movements, politicians, philosophers, authors, and more. While not entirely recognizable to the fascism of today, certain factors such as a totalitarian state and unity through nationality are present even in these very early ancestors of fascism. Modern-day fascism came into the picture in early 20th century Europe, in the fallout of World War I. The first fascist leader was Benito Mussolini, who, after initially working with the Italian Socialist Party for years, split up with the party due to his pro-war stance. Him and a group of followers thus gave birth to modern fascism. The word fascism, fascismo in Italian, comes from the Latin word fasces, meaning a bundle of wooden rods containing an axe. It was used as a symbol of unitary authority in ancient Rome, and Mussolini and his group of fascists would certainly prove to live up to the legacy of the symbol. Now, when we think of fascism today, we often think about people angrily droning on about the supremacy and greatness of their race and pointing out the perceived inherent flaws of other races and groups of other people in order to justify their destruction. However, with the initial emergence of Mussolini's fascist movement, this wasn't exactly the case. It wasn't so outwardly racist. Mussolini's fascist party even campaigned for some socialist policies in the very beginning, such as an 8-hour workday, minimum wage, and progressive taxes on the rich. However, many other brutal and harsh elements of fascism were present in Mussolini's movement from the very beginning. Widespread violence and intimidation of political opponents, hardcore nationalism, and disdain for legal processes are what fueled Mussolini's rise to the top of Italian politics, and what kept him there until his eventual overthrow. As time went on, hate-filled aspects of fascism, such as outright racism in the form of discrimination against Italian Jews or natives in Italian colonies, became central pillars of the ideology, leading to innumerable war crimes and atrocities. The relative equality of early fascism was essentially eliminated, and in its place stood extreme social Darwinism and rigid hierarchy at the core of it all. As mentioned before, fascism promotes the authority of the ruling party-controlled state over all else. Strict social laws are enforced by a totalitarian state via its secret police and military. In fascist parties that don't have government control, this need is filled by extrajudicial militias and paramilitary groups that are blindly loyal to the fascist movement and its leader, such as Mussolini's Black Shirts and Hitler's Storm Detachment. In the eyes of fascists, anyone and anything that doesn't conform to the strict ideals of the party in any way must be eliminated from society by any means necessary. The ruling party is seen as one and the same with the state, and countering the party, and by extension its leader, in any way is disrespectful to the nation and its people as a whole. For fascists, any opposition is treason, and there is no room for any sort of expression or action that goes against these thoughts. This mindset extends to all the people in a given society, with special emphasis placed on youth in a fascist system. Fascism also eliminates economic freedoms by only rewarding and promoting businesses that promote their perceived interests of the nation, and totally submit to the ruling party. Any action to protect the rights of the workers who create everything is crushed in order to provide as much as possible for a fascist nation's war machine and demanding elites. The ultimate goal is self-sufficiency, with a heavy emphasis on devoting vast resources to the military at the expense of everyday citizens, most of whom don't have a direct contribution to the fascist party or the nation's armed forces. During the interwar period, many fascist parties and leaders would grow exponentially, and in some cases even come into power, all across Europe. These include, but are not limited to, Mussolini's National Fascist Party in Italy, Hitler's Nazi Party in Germany, Franco's Falange Party in Spain, Austria's Fatherland Front, Portugal's National Union, Croatia's Ustaše, Romania's Iron Guard, and Norway's National Rally, among others. However, this international trend of a fascist rise didn't just stop in Europe. For example, Japan's militaristic dictatorship, led by figures such as Hideki Tojo, solidified its rule during the same interwar period. Even in the United States, the fascist Ku Klux Klan reached its all-time peak of membership and organization during the early to mid-1920s. Now, given that these movements had different national origins and were established in different political contexts, it's only natural that there would be some differences in the fine details of their ideologies. Not all fascist movements believed in biological racism and inherent racial superiority, although the classification of different races as distinctly separate was universal, even though race is nothing but a widely accepted social construct. Also, the vast majority of fascist movements did indeed espouse said beliefs, such as the Nazis in Germany lambasting the supposed racial inferiority of Jews, the Ustaše in Croatia preaching the supposed racial inferiority of Serbs, and the KKK in America espousing the supposed supremacy of white Protestants. Another example of diversity within fascism is that some fascist movements saw religion as an essential upholder of culture, tradition, and social order, while many others rejected mainstream religion for its apparent sympathy for the weak and outside influences, and seek to replace it with a more traditional form of worship. For example, the Iron Guard in Romania and Falange in Spain both placed great emphasis on their nation's respective largest churches as critical institutions of Romanian and Spanish society, respectively. The Nazis, on the other hand, felt that Christianity was, quote, incompatible with Nazism because of its connection with Judaism and preferred pagan rituals and iconography instead. However, even given these minor differences in ideology and thought, what must be remembered is that these movements work in tandem with one another and help contribute to the rise of others like them. The rapid simultaneous rise of fascism throughout not only Europe, but the rest of the world during the interwar period wasn't a coincidence. All of these movements still shared many common core ideological themes, such as militaristic nationalism, disregard for electoral democracy, a belief in a rigid social hierarchy ruled strictly by a superior race, and a desire for cultural homogeneity. Violence as a means to put this horrific worldview into practice is a common theme among these groups as well. Almost all fascist movements form militias and paramilitary groups in order to threaten and intimidate political opposition. And because of the inherently violent nature of fascism from the start, it makes sense that when the ideology itself is put into practice, millions suffer as a result. The most important thing to remember about fascism as a whole is that, in achieving its goals, fascism has time and time again led to horrific planned mass tragedies such as genocide, eugenics, mass censorship, severe inequality, torture, discrimination, and many more on an absolutely unimaginable scale. Any warning signs of this should be urgently acknowledged and understood with the full knowledge of what unkempt hate is capable of doing to this world. In order to fully understand the rise of fascism, it is important to understand the context in which fascist ideas spread and manifest, and that context is almost always crisis and hardship. Fascism, and extreme political ideology in general, becomes appealing to a large amount of people when they are out of hope. when normal political systems and methods have been tried and have failed, when they have suffered great loss and faced great uncertainty. It is in situations like these that political extremism becomes the only way out for many people, a sort of, well, we've fallen this far, we've got nothing to lose, sort of method of thinking. This is how and why extremist and violent ideas such as fascism can end up winning over even the majority of a nation in some circumstances. There were two main catalysts for the initial rise of fascism, namely World War I and the Great Depression. Firstly, the reason that so many fascist movements started picking up steam in the aftermath of World War I was because of the effect that the war had on the national psyche and pride of certain nations. Countries that had lost the war were stripped of much of their land, and much of Europe had its population scarred and marred by the horrors of war, leading to widespread fear, anger, and resentment. Germany in particular was extremely humiliated and debilitated by the Treaty of Versailles due to the reduction of its resources as well as the massive reparations that the Allies demanded from the struggling nation. All of this was bad enough on its own. However, the already unordinary conditions would be exacerbated by the world's next great crisis. In 1929, the world was rocked by the Wall Street crash and subsequent Great Depression, which took about a decade to fully recover from. The Depression hit the Americas and Europe the worst, putting millions out of work and many more into poverty. Many people interpreted this as yet another failure of liberal capitalism, the dominant ideology of the interwar governments, due to its seemingly constant cycles of economic prosperity followed by depression. The relatively weak democratic governments of Europe weren't able to do much to slow the economic decline, and thus the blame was placed on them. A desire for change rose amongst the populace, and as a result, many started moving to political extremes. This was especially true in countries that felt like they were wronged by the allies of World War I in some way, the most prominent examples being Germany, Italy, and Japan. In searching for change, many Europeans, especially those of the lower working class, turned to communism as a means of bettering their hopeless chances. The upward trending post-revolution economy of the Soviet Union was looking really good in contrast to the chaotic, slumping mess that was the economies of Western and Central Europe. Socialism and communism thus became a popular force in Europe, and one that started to frighten not only European fascists, but governments and business magnates as well. Anti-communist movements of the time, which often had connections to or were led by fascist parties, thus tapped into the fear of communism on the continent to garner support, especially from industry leaders who feared socialist-inspired collective action by their workers. Aside from the business world, fascist movements also often have less extreme politicians to thank in part for their rise to the top. In times of political uncertainty, moderate conservative politicians have sided with far-right extremists in an effort to temporarily restore order and get a desired electoral outcome. This exact rise to power happened in Germany with the Nazis, when Hitler negotiated with German center-right leaders such as Paul von Hindenburg and Franz von Papen in order to acquire a position in government, motivated by a fear of German communist revolution. An important thing to remember is that one thing that tied together the rise of fascism, in all of its different forms, throughout Europe and the wider world during the interwar period was crisis, and that is what continues to be a common theme amongst the rise of fascist movements to this day. Be it economic or social, fascist movements capitalize off of said crises to gain support from those who feel left behind. They shift the blame away from the government's mistakes and the market force's inability to naturally provide the people with what they need. Instead, fascists shift the anger towards outside forces such as an opposing political group or minority ethnic or religious group. In turn, fascist movements will tell the people that forcing these outside groups out of power, whether they actually hold any power or not, and uniting the country under racial purity and the glorious, unquestioned leader will eliminate weakness and fix society's problems. In reality, all this ends up achieving is a tyrannical government that discriminates and commits atrocities against said opposing groups. Making heavy use of racial tensions and anti-minority sentiment is universal amongst fascists. Attacking minority groups as the source of the society's weakness gives people a common enemy and something to unite against. It makes you feel better about yourself to think that something bad isn't your fault, and that there's someone or a group of people that you can blame all of your problems on. Racial minorities, religious minorities, the LGBTQ community, political opponents, and basically all people who aren't exactly as the fascist rulers want them to be serve as a vague and malicious threat for fascist movements. All problems are their fault in the eyes of fascists. Anger and fear of the populace, cultivated in times of strife, are harnessed by fascist movements to propel their own rise to the top. Combine this with widespread lies, manipulation, propaganda, and total government control, and pretty soon you've got the whole population believing exactly what you want from them, no matter how exaggerated or made up it is. Of course, you can't get to this point without consolidating your power first. But how do you go about doing that? Take control of whatever state institutions you can by installing your allies and make frequent use of violence and intimidation to tighten your grip on power. At first, militias of fascist supporters target minority civilians and clash with political opponents. Once the fascist movement gains more power and the militias are better organized, political opponents are silenced and/or extrajudicially killed by these groups. Who needs a functioning legal system when you're a dictator, eh? It worked out well for Mussolini and Hitler after all. And while even thinking about such a government might scare you a little bit, it is part of the rhetoric that fascists use to gain support among the people. By giving the people a strong leader to look towards and promising to bring weakened societies to their former glory, fascists can seem appealing to a society that has been plagued by ineffective government and social collapse. When you've hit rock bottom, there's nowhere to go but up, and fascist leaders often market themselves as one-man solutions to the problems that got you to rock bottom in the first place. Making a weakened country great again by the grace of the leader is a common central theme of fascist movements, regardless of time or place. Simple, decisive solutions and grand eye-catching promises are prominent during a fascist rise. Fascists make a point of promising people what they want, especially in times of strife. Jobs for the unemployed and job secureless, a counterweight to communist influence for industry executives, price controls for farmers, stable buying power for pensioners, it's all there, even if the proposed solutions aren't particularly realistic and are lacking key details. This is the ultimate fast track to far-right populism, a strong movement with simple answers for complicated problems, caused by evil scapegoats to be cleansed from society. This gives supporters a distinct enemy to direct all of their energy towards, and hope that a major change will come very soon. In the spring 2003 issue of Free Inquiry magazine, political scientist Dr. Lawrence W. Britt published an article titled, "Fascism Anyone?" Based off of his research into a group of different fascist regimes throughout the 20th century, Dr. Britt lists 14 universal warning signs of fascism based off of the rhetoric and actions of these regimes and their supporters. This article subsequently went on to become the most popular article in the magazine's history, being cited everywhere from university courses to the United States Holocaust Museum. If there is one thing that I want you to take away from this video, it is these warning signs. Keep them in mind going further, as they are a great way to judge whether or not those in power are setting their nation on a dangerous course. Dr. Britt's 14 warning signs of fascism are: powerful and continuing expressions of nationalism, disdain for the importance of human rights, identification of enemies and scapegoats as a unifying cause, supremacy of the military, rampant sexism, a controlled mass media, obsession with national security, religion and ruling elite tied together, power of corporations protected, power of labor suppressed or eliminated, disdain and suppression of intellectuals and the arts, obsession with crime and punishment, rampant cronyism and corruption, and finally, fraudulent elections. Since the dawn of the millennium, global fascism has seen a recent resurgence. Far-right organizations and parties have been growing in strength and numbers, so much so that mainstream media and the wider populace in general have taken note, as mentioned in the start of this video. This has led to an enabling of far-right demonstrations, often marred by violence, around the world as a result. As of 2019, the Global Terrorism Index reports that far-right terrorism in the West, defined in the report as North America, Western Europe, and Oceania, has increased by 320% over the past 5 years. Many around the world have been radicalized in the wake of the 2008 financial crash, providing a similar economic crisis as the Great Depression did during the interwar period. In Europe, where the rise of the far right has been especially prominent, a growing migrant crisis combined with fears of a loss of national sovereignty and identity due to the European Union have been a large factor in the surge of support for nationalist parties. The rise of the European far-right in recent years has been characterized by outspoken right-wing nationalism, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and borderline Islamophobia. Similar movements are also cropping up all over the world, modeling themselves after one another in an attempt to spread their dangerous ideology as far as possible. But certainly these new movements can't be going as far as to replicate fascist movements of the past, right? The far-right Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD, is the largest opposition party in the German parliament, and has been gaining ever more power and influence in the country since its founding in 2013. Much of their support comes from rural, economically weak parts of Germany. Although initially solely an anti-EU party, in recent years the AfD has shifted further to the right and made immigration, specifically Islamic immigration, a main focus, with party leaders having called it, quote, an invasion of foreigners. During his time as party co-chair, Member of Parliament Alexander Gauland had described the Nazi regime as, quote, just a speck of bird's muck in more than 1,000 years of successful German history, which outraged many for the downplaying of such a historically heavy subject in Germany. The AfD have frequently used xenophobic rhetoric, and the not insignificant part of the party, especially some members of the extremist Der Flügel faction, have been found to have ties to Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, and neo-Nazi groups. AfD politicians have frequently branded the media reporting on them as Lügenpresse, or the lying press. They have called for closing of German borders and the banning of mosques and veils specifically, targeting Germany's large Muslim minority. Björn Höcke, a central figure in the AfD, lashed out at Berlin's infamous Holocaust memorial, expressing anger that the Germans were the, quote, only people in the world who planted a memorial of shame in the heart of their capital. This constant harsh anti-immigrant rhetoric, combined with the downplaying of Germany's fascist history, are disturbing signs to say the least, especially coming from a country that has a very good reason to not allow fascists to take power again. The fact that the AfD are the largest opposition party in the German parliament is thus quite a cause for concern. Italy's largest opposition party is Lega, or the League, led by its founder Matteo Salvini. Salvini's messaging has been consistent throughout his political career, populist rhetoric that consists of simple solutions to the problems that he sees as plaguing Italy. He has raged against the pro-globalist establishment and Italy's rates of immigration, with a focus on Muslim migrants from northern Africa. Combine that with a struggling economy, and Salvini's League movement has surged in popularity in the past 5 years. Salvini's rhetoric is no short of extremism, however. He has made sexist and disparaging remarks against the female Speaker of Parliament in the past, said that immigration leads to, quote, drug dealing, rape, theft, and violence, end quote, and called for a, quote, mass cleaning of migrants in Italy, with, quote, strong methods if necessary. The emphasis on race and ethnicity in Salvini's policies has sparked alarming comparisons to Benito Mussolini, most infamously when he said that the Romani minority of Italy should have their own separate census. The singling out of the Romani via exclusionist policies such as a separate census was a hallmark of Mussolini's tenure as fascist dictator of Italy. Salvini's words have also inspired some horrifying actions, such as in February of 2018, when a member and former local candidate of the League committed a drive-by terror attack, shooting 6 African migrants in a central Italian town. As is the case in Germany, Italy's largest opposition party has some disturbing ties and callbacks to the country's fascist past. The League have cemented themselves as Italy's largest opposition in both houses of parliament, and Salvini is continuing to espouse his extremist rhetoric from his seat within the halls of the Italian Senate. The National Rally, until recently known as the National Front, has burst into the French political mainstream in the past decade. It was founded by Jean-Marie Le Pen in 1972, and in its initial days was extremely far-right. Party rallies and platforms consisted of outright hate speech, Holocaust denial, and Islamophobia. In modern years, the party has been taken over by Jean-Marie's daughter, Marine Le Pen, who subsequently kicked her father out of the party. Despite reforms on the younger Le Pen's part to make the party seem less extreme and outright fascistic, the party still retains elements of extreme nationalism and hostility towards outsiders at its core. The National Rally is staunchly anti-EU and has frequently peddled anti-immigrant rhetoric, with Le Pen herself even painting illegal immigrants as criminals and rapists, despite data saying otherwise. Le Pen has called for the banning of headscarves, yarmulkes, and turbans in public, targeting France's sizable Muslim, Jewish, and Sikh minorities. She has even sparked outrage for denying French collaboration in the Holocaust, even though the French state formally took responsibility and apologized for these very actions many years ago. In spite of all of these vile statements, the National Front ended up making it to the final round of the 2017 French presidential elections. Young voters, anxious about high unemployment and costs of living, flocked to Le Pen and her far-right movement. It is also important to note that it was many of these same young voters who, during the broader anti-government Yellow Vest protests, made up the right-wing elements of these protests, which have been caught spreading anti-Semitic messages. Spain's most recent elections, at both a regional and national level, have seen strong showings from the far-right Vox party. Founded in 2014 by leader Santiago Abascal, Vox has gained much of its support due to its harsh stance on immigration, in response to high numbers of immigration into Spain from North Africa as part of the larger European migrant crisis of recent years. Abascal has called for the deportation of all illegal immigrants from Spain. Alongside this, Vox has also tried to roll back legislation aimed at protecting women from domestic abuse and gender violence, with many members of the party claiming that such legislation, quote, discriminates against men. Abascal has also strongly opposed abortion and gay marriage, as well as autonomy for Spain's Catalonia region, which has campaigned for autonomy and even independence for decades. When former fascist dictator of Spain, Francisco Franco's body was to be moved from a grand mausoleum built after his death to a low-key burial site, Abascal spoke out strongly against it, claiming that it was an unjust rewriting of history. Spain's far-right movement has been following the same patterns as many other such movements in Europe, including the demonization of immigrants and the downplaying of past fascism. Spain's far-right might not have as much power as some of the others on this list, yet they are still a cause for concern due to their rise. Kind of ironic that their name is Vox, though. The Freiheitliche Partei Österreich, or Austrian Freedom Party, was founded in 1955 by Anton Reinthaler, a former high-ranking member of the Nazi Party and SS officer. Despite this, and an initial flocking of former Nazis to the party, outside pressure kept the FPO as a moderate centrist party for decades. However, in the 1980s, the party started to shift further and further to the right, as it made anti-immigration and identity politics centered on the exclusion of the, quote, ethnic other, central pillars of its policies. In the new millennium especially, the FPO has taken special focus on scapegoating Muslims as threats to Austria and criticizing Islamic culture. The party frequently obsesses over national security, claiming that it wants to defend Austrian culture and tradition from the perceived threats of immigrants. Party slogans such as Vienna must not become Istanbul and No Home for Islam have paired well with proposed FPO policies such as excluding immigrants from certain Austrian social programs and benefits. This has led to increasing attacks on immigrants in the country, especially towards the Muslim-majority ethnic groups of Austria such as Turks, Bosnians, and Kurds. Up until recently, the FPO were in fact a part of Austria's governing majority, but lost a large chunk of its support in May of 2019 after a shocking scandal. Party leader Heinz Christian Strache was caught on tape saying that he wanted to use corruption and bribery to censor Austrian media in order to benefit the FPO, citing the corrupt and autocratic government of Hungary's Viktor Orban as an example. More on him later. Despite this loss of support, to this day the Austrian Freedom Party remains the largest opposition party of the Austrian right. Sweden is, at least in mainstream media, often held up as a very progressive country that, for the most part, has proved itself an example on inclusivity, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, and a myriad of other topics. However, for all of Sweden's successes, its democracy has also not been immune to the rise of the far right, who have come in the form of the Sweden Democrats. When the party was first started in the late 80s, many of its members had strong connections to fascist and white nationalist groups. The party's first auditor, Gustav Ekström, was a Waffen-SS veteran and had been a member of Sweden's own Nazi party created during the 1930s. The SD's first chairman, Anders Karlström, for his part, was previously an active member of Sweden's Nordic Real Party, a neo-Nazi political party. It also wasn't uncommon to spot the occasional Nazi uniform or insignia at SD party events during that time. However, similar to the National Rally in France, the Sweden Democrats have undergone changes to kick out old members and soften its image in recent years. Although, in spite of these changes, the Sweden Democrats remain staunchly anti-immigrant, and their campaigning is full of baseless claims that multiculturalism is a bad thing for Swedish society. Many racism scandals have rocked the party in recent years, such as when a local SD candidate shared a song on Facebook with the lyrics, quote, "Swedes are white and the country is ours," end quote. The party, for its part, has seen relative successes despite all of this, and to this day remains one of the largest opposition parties in the Swedish parliament. It is also the only party not part of a broader alliance, as the other parties don't want to associate with the controversial Sweden Democrats by working with them directly. Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, has held his office for over 10 years now, and in that time, the right-wing leader has consolidated his power and become increasingly more authoritarian. Corruption in his government is widespread, especially amongst the ultra-wealthy few who are personally close to Orbán and who receive kickbacks and lavish government contracts regularly. It is as a result of this widespread corruption that Hungary is now the third most corrupt country in all of Europe, behind only Greece and Bulgaria. Even though Orbán was elected on the back of public outrage at the previous center-left government and the wave of support, he only exacerbated government inefficiency in order to benefit himself and those close to him. Poverty is at 40%, half of which live in extreme poverty, and 44% of Hungarians can't even afford basic goods as real estate prices have risen by 31%. A failing and underfunded healthcare system now means that Hungary has not only Europe's highest child mortality rate, but its lowest life expectancy. And all through this, Orbán has cracked down on freedom of expression and the press, restricted Hungarians' access to the internet, and has peddled anti-immigrant rhetoric. He has said on TV that, quote, "We will never allow Hungary to become a target country for immigrants. We do not want to see significantly sized minorities with different cultural characteristics and backgrounds among us. We want to keep Hungary as Hungary." Right-wing strongmen with dictatorial actions have been plaguing many countries in this worldwide rise of the far right. Hungary is a perfect example of how this phenomenon manifests itself, even in a supposed democracy. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Bharatiya Janata Party have been sowing division and violence in India for decades, and their power is only growing. The BJP and its predecessor, the Janata Party, are and were political arms of the older Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which I will be calling the RSS because I don't want to butcher that pronunciation again. The RSS is a paramilitary group that was formed in 1925 to assert Hindu supremacy on the Indian subcontinent, and it still plays an influential role in Indian politics today as the ideological backbone of Modi's BJP. This is despite the fact that they are currently banned from participating in Indian elections and have been banned from operating at all multiple times throughout modern Indian history. The early leaders of the RSS were admirers of Hitler and Mussolini's fascist movements because of their commitments to cultural nationalism and minority persecution, even occasionally communicating with European fascist leaders. Early RSS leader M.S. Walker even wrote his praise for Hitler's steps taken to ensure, quote, "the purity of the race and its culture." Thus, the RSS, as well as India's ruling BJP, advocate for Hindutva, or political Hindu nationalism. The idea that India is a nation ran by and for Hindus only, despite its unmatched internal ethnic, cultural, and linguistic diversity. This diversity is precisely why India's founders, such as Nehru and Gandhi, who, side note, was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist who had been a member of the RSS, established India as a multicultural and secular republic for all, a legacy which Hindutva is now trying desperately to erase. This ideology has thus repeatedly singled out minorities in India and has historically led to organized violence by Hindu nationalist groups such as the RSS. Not to be outdone, Prime Minister Modi himself was controversial even before taking office for his complicitness and alleged support of the 2002 Gujarat pogroms against Muslims. Modi's presidency has been marred by attacks on religious and ethnic minorities, especially Muslims, who number some 195 million in India, from members and supporters of his BJP. The Modi government has cut off new pathways to citizenship for Muslims and has passed legislation to strip citizenship away from them as well. Minority persecution is rife in the Modi administration, so much so that the Washington, D.C.-based human rights watchdog Genocide Watch has issued 2 genocide alerts for India as a result of Modi's discrimination against India's Muslims. They are often targeted as scapegoats for problems in the country, with BJP leaders such as Amit Shah going so far as to have labeled Muslim refugees to India fleeing persecution from neighboring countries as, quote, infiltrators and termites. When protests erupted against these racist policies, the government cracked down harshly and violently. BJP politician Dilip Ghosh has called those fighting for fellow Indians to be recognized as citizens, quote, devils and parasites. India is the world's largest and arguably most diverse democracy, which makes it all the more painful that such diversity is under such threat. And even though India isn't mentioned nearly as much as it should be in Western media, the fact that it's sliding so quickly towards what is arguably fascism should greatly disturb the wider world. Since the 2012 election of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Japan's far right has become increasingly emboldened. These groups, known as Uyoku Dantai, number in the thousands and have seen their demonstrations and presence in Japanese society increase significantly in the past decade. Abe himself, as well as other fringe members of his Liberal Democratic Party, are part of such an organization called Nihon Kaigi. Unlike other Uyoku Dantai, Nihon Kaigi holds ultra-nationalist, monarchist, and historically revisionist views, which have been historically dangerous in Japan. Japanese ultranationalists harken back to the late 19th and early to mid-20th centuries, when Japan was at the height of its imperial prowess and subjugating peoples in and around the Pacific. There is a real desire amongst those like former Prime Minister Abe to return to that imperial fascistic time because of the perceived greatness that it brought to Japan. Many of them continue to glorify the Japanese Empire and the many atrocities that came along with it because of their nationalist ideology. Uyoku Dantai also tried to influence the teaching of Japanese history by downplaying, and even flat-out denying, historical Japanese aggressions and war crimes, such as the rape of Nanking or the Bataan Death March. Japanese nationalists like Abe have also made strides to rewrite Japan's pacifist constitution in order to build up a large military just like in the days of the empire, fully aware of the destructive path that Japanese military aggression leads to. Controversial shrines like Yasukuni, which is symbolic of the far-right movement in Japan, revere the soldiers who fought for the emperor and whitewash the history of their crimes. They have thus become the site of frequent demonstrations by far-right citizens and politicians alike. The deportation of Korean and Chinese minorities in Japan has also been called for, alongside limitations to Japan's already very strict immigration criterion. Now, as I'm sure is becoming clearer and clearer at this point, far-right movements in previously fascist nations have a habit of downplaying fascist history and calling for a return to an abstract, former glory of the nation. Lack of education on war crimes leads to blind idolization and a path to forgetting or even repeating the atrocities of the past. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. The president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, was elected in 2018 amongst a wave of populist hype during a quite hopeless time in Brazilian politics. Far-reaching corruption scandals had indicted many of Brazil's top politicians, and unemployment and crime were at extreme highs. This created a desire amongst the people for a radical change, and Bolsonaro managed to use that desire to his advantage. Bolsonaro was a longtime congressman, known for his far-right authoritarian views and deeply offensive rhetoric. Environmentally, Bolsonaro not only wants to withdraw Brazil from the Paris Climate Accord, but has also weakened Brazil's own internal environmental protections. This has allowed loggers to run rampant in the Amazon, cutting down swaths of trees and further damaging the already fragile ecosystem. Not to mention that all of that is being done on indigenous land, without any consultation of the native tribes whose sacred land is being exploited by giant Brazilian corporations. But even willingly massacring the lungs of the earth in the name of monetary gain isn't outstanding compared to what Bolsonaro has said about governance and social issues. A former military captain during Brazil's brutal military dictatorship, Bolsonaro has said some truly frightening things regarding his tough-on-crime stance. He has expressed support for dictatorial government in TV interviews, and once in a televised interview even said, quote, "I am in favor of torture, you know that, and the people are too. Though through the vote, you won't change anything in this country. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's only going to change, unfortunately, when we get to a civil war, doing the job that the military regime didn't do, killing 30,000. During a TV interview, when talking about solutions to lower crime, Bolsonaro also said that, quote, "A policeman who doesn't kill isn't a policeman." Bolsonaro also has a really disgusting history of sexism and misogyny throughout his career.
Dá, eu te dou outra.
He also told a female journalist during an interview that, quote, "If I were a cadet in the military academy, I would whistle at you. You're very pretty." Bolsonaro's career has also been rife with extreme homophobia. He once said in a BBC interview that homosexuals, quote, "want to teach our children to turn them into gay adults to satisfy their sexuality in the future." On Brazilian TV, he expressed that if one had a gay child, that they should, quote, "take a whip and change their behavior." During a different speech on Brazilian television, Bolsonaro also said that, quote, "Would you hire a gay driver to take your children to school? Of course not." Not satisfied with all of that, Bolsonaro also has a history of racist remarks, saying in the past that refugees arriving in Brazil are, quote, "the scum of the world." Bolsonaro has also referred to Afro-Brazilians by saying, quote, "they get nothing done. I think they aren't even good for breeding anymore." It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that Bolsonaro is a deeply unpleasant person. Even so, his tough-on-crime stance in such a lawless and violent nation brought some semblance of comfort to some. Although that's certainly not an excuse for the countless horrific things that he has said throughout his life. Because of that, tens of millions of Brazilians are fearing not only for their democracy, but for their fundamental rights as people. And as much as it pains me to say, I don't think that you can blame them for that. Ever since 2003, Turkey has been under the rule of the right-wing and Islamist Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who initially rose to power as a political outsider, but is now anything but. Erdogan and his allies control the vast majority of press coverage in Turkey, and have been cracking down on any sort of opposition in various ways. Erdogan's time in office has been marred by the diminishing freedom of the press, with journalists frequently and arbitrarily jailed due to negative coverage of Erdogan and his party. The government has responded harshly and violently to any sort of protest by the people, and has cracked down on the open internet in order to prevent any public organization against them. Much of the internal dissent has been quashed by labeling any opponents as terrorists, and subsequently jailing them due to a justice system also under Erdogan's de facto control. Erdogan's aggressive foreign policy, becoming more apparent in the past decade, has seen imperialist military interventions by Turkey in and around surrounding nations such as Greece, Cyprus, Syria, and Libya. Domestically, Erdogan's longest project has been to dismantle Turkey's secular institutions, in an effort to turn the country into what is effectively an Islamic theocracy. Even though Turkey was set up as a staunchly secular society to provide its people with more freedom and autonomy, Erdogan's authoritarian Islamism has worked much of that back, harkening back to the Ottoman Empire of the past. And, much like the Ottoman Empire, the Erdogan regime has been historically cruel and oppressive of minorities, especially to Turkey's large Kurdish minority in the southeast of the country. Many Kurdish officials and politicians have been accused of terrorism and jailed arbitrarily, not to mention the forced displacement and destruction of Kurdish villages that has repeatedly caught the eye of European human rights watchdogs. Not to mention the widespread misinformation, media manipulation, and electoral fraud that has become a staple of recent Turkish elections thanks to Erdogan and his party. Add on rampant corruption, nepotism, and cronyism that goes right to the top of the Turkish government, and you've got all the good ingredients for a proto-fascist dictatorship on your hands. The UK's far right have achieved a lot of crucial victories over the past decade, much to the dismay of onlookers in Europe as well as Britain's large immigrant communities. The standout achievement of this wave of nationalism was that of Brexit, a knee-jerk reaction by the British people, although mostly the English, against the European migrant crisis and the supposed high price of EU membership, which turned out to be a lie. Far-right British parties such as the UK Independence Party have made anti-immigrant rhetoric targeting Muslims and other immigrant groups central to their platforms. It is thus no surprise that said parties have had their own share of racism scandals, with some politicians having connections to extreme right groups. Such groups, such as Britain First or the English Defence League, have seen their membership and organizations surge, and their attacks on minorities become more commonplace. Although the UK's many fringe right groups might try to distance themselves from such claims, claiming that they are only defending the country against radicals and terrorists, their overgeneralization of migrants and frequent use of indiscriminate violence speaks for itself. For many, this part comes as a sort of elephant in the room. And indeed, it was the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States that alerted many to the growing trend of authoritarian right-wing politics around the world. So, do Trump's actions justify his connotation with such a controversial and disturbing group of people? Well, Objectively, yes. A very resounding yes. The Trump administration, and even his policies and rhetoric in general, have exhibited many of the early warning signs of fascism, so much so that Dr. Britt's article about the 14 warning signs went viral in January of 2017, around the time of Trump's inauguration, because of his perceived similarity to the listed warning signs. For starters, his aggressively nationalistic worldview, summed up by his slogan, "America First," has seen America pull out of many international agreements and become more diplomatically closed off and hostile. This includes an emphasis on projecting American power through military might, to a level that goes even beyond the normally high levels of American militaristic nationalism. He has frequently made sexist and homophobic remarks, and his administration has frequently tried to pass legislation and argue court cases to strip the rights of America's vulnerable LGBTQ community. Trump has made frequent use of scapegoats since the beginning of his presidential run, constantly making baseless claims about the dangers of Muslim and Mexican immigrants. He also has a habit of scapegoating political opponents as radicals who are destroying the country despite no definite evidence of this, and throws around terms such as socialist, radical, and Antifa, despite the subjects of his criticism not having any connection with these terms at all. This constant pathological lying has led to a personality cult around the president, with propagandist channels such as Fox News and OAN often peddling outright conspiracy theories to Trump's blindly loyal base. Examples of conspiracy theories that are now mainstream amongst Trump and his supporters include QAnon and claims that the 2020 election were fraudulent, both of which have been proved false time and time again. Trump's policies also include extreme obsessions with security, law, and religion. He has been attempting to build a wall along the US-Mexico border and has also implemented bans on travel and immigration from Muslim-majority nations to the United States, although none of them are in effect as of now due to court rulings. Trump has cracked down harshly on protests against his government, encouraging the police and National Guard to use extreme measures against protesters and refusing to condemn actions of police violence against them. Trump has also filled many cabinet positions with evangelical Christians, and has pushed for the revoking of the right for American women to have abortions. Trump's name has also been synonymous with corruption and shady business practices, starting from even before his presidency. During his time in the White House, Trump was first accused of ties to the Russian government, and while many ties were discovered, nothing of an explicitly illegal nature was found. However, Trump did later become the third ever American president to be impeached, as a result of his attempt to coerce Ukraine into giving him damaging information about his opponent in the 2020 election, Joe Biden. However, even with all of these horrible developments of recent years, what has definitely been the most dangerous consequence of the Trump presidency has been the emboldening of the American far right. Since the election of Trump, extremist pro-Trump militias such as the Boogaloo movement and the Proud Boys have been organizing and growing at incredibly fast rates. Similar groups and individuals have committed many domestic terror attacks in the past 4 years, and hate crimes are on the rise. It has created an atmosphere of tension, division, hate, and fear, the likes of which haven't been seen in the United States for a long time. But at least he's lost the election and we'll never have to worry about him again. Oh wait. First of all, I would just like to note that this section of the video was by no means a full or comprehensive list. There is a lot of information regarding the particular movements that I've covered that I have either left out or haven't researched, and I encourage you to look into any that you are interested in so that you can organize against them better and protect your community. There are also plenty of other nations with their own influential far-right movements that I haven't covered, so keep that in mind as well. Regardless, the sheer spread of movements that all have such similar qualities is genuinely disturbing, at least to me. A far-right movement in one influential nation is bad enough, let alone in dozens of them. Most of them also check a decent amount of the warning signs of fascism, with long-standing government checks and a little bit of organized dissent often the only thing standing in the way between certain leaders and all-out fascism. Many of the leaders mentioned in this video also have been on record praising and meeting with one another. In Europe especially, right-wing populist parties often form continental coalitions and come together via organizations such as the Identity and Democracy Party. Undoubtedly, at least from an ideological perspective, far-right authoritarianism has established a foothold in our world, and is making waves in Western democracies especially. Given the potential stakes if they ever were to get into power, it is absolutely essential that we do not let them win and put their messages of hate and bigotry into action. Given that, this begs the question, how do we make sure that they don't win? Well, the first thing you should probably do is assess the threat level of far-right extremism where you live. Research your own leaders to see if they exhibit any fascist tendencies. Dr. Britt's 14 warning signs are a good place to start, for example. You should also intervene if you see someone close to you, such as a family member or a friend, falling into a rabbit hole of far-right propaganda and lies. When so much fascistic propaganda is based off of pathological lies, it is possible to disprove the rhetoric and drag someone off that path. In terms of yourself, always approach what politicians say with healthy skepticism, especially if they are running on populist platforms. Make sure that what they say is backed up by their policies and past actions, and don't blindly support a politician. Remember that they work for you, not the other way around. Another way to combat aggressive thinking is to not vaguely exploit or attack an opposing group, and make sure the politicians that you support don't do the same. Educate yourself and those around you about the complex nature of people groups. Overgeneralizations, especially those directed at minority groups, are always a bad sign in a politician. And probably the most important piece of advice that I could possibly give you is to get active. Political activism, even at a grassroots level, is incredibly important to instigating change. Every single second put into a movement helps it to grow, so don't let dangerous people be the only ones to put in that time and effort. Get your ideas out there and use your power as a person. In a similar vein to grassroots activism, always be sure to defend your rights as a citizen and as a person, as that is what authoritarians tend to take away from the people in order to consolidate their own power. Defend the rights of others as well, especially marginalized and vulnerable groups such as racial minorities, sexual and gender minorities, the working class, those with terminal illnesses, and other such people. Do everything in your power to demand that their rights are enshrined and protected, because once they start to be oppressed, it becomes much easier for you to be oppressed as well, given that you aren't already a member of such a group. Also, do it because it's just a nice thing to do. Looking out for the well-being of others is a great way to keep your community safe and happy. And if you know that some around you are going through times of crisis, show them compassion and understanding. It may seem unrelated to the topic at hand, but people who feel like outcasts and rejected from society are much more likely to turn to extremist ideology and are often sought after by far-right groups because of this. Fascism has led to war, destruction, genocide, and many more unspeakable horrors everywhere which it has manifested. The possibility of this alone is enough to underline why the current rise of the far right is so important to stop. Saying that it couldn't happen here or that connecting these two is a stretch is not a viable option. The stakes are too high for us to fail. Never forget the tragedies of the past and do whatever you can to make sure history doesn't repeat itself in this way. Hate and division may be strong, but love and solidarity are even stronger.